All right, I welcome you back. I invite you to turn to our brand new study of Ecclesiastes. This will be simply part 2, and the thing in which I've titled, the theme, I should say, of what I've entitled this message is a book without time or place. That's so true, really, of all of Scripture, that, it was written long ago, but it's so true today. Given that we're still in the very early stages of this, I wanted to take just a few minutes to remind ourselves of some things about the background and the opening of chapter 1, and then we're going to conclude the entirety of chapter 1 today. All right, so there's a lot happening in the world, and that's one of the things that led me to go to this book. We are continuing every day to hear more and more about the election, and if you think that you know the answer to it, I wish you well. Who knows what's going to happen? We have wars, continuing wars in the Middle East, wars with Russia and Ukraine. There's countless other wars. Worries about the economy. It's up, it's down. The stock market's up and down. Inflation. Just anxiety, our individual lives, the stress. So, all that being said, Ecclesiastes is a book all about wisdom. And some of it's hard. But if you are searching after wisdom in your individual life, you're searching for wisdom in the midst of all this stress and anxiety and uncertainty, I hope this is a book that will help us deal with these things. The background of it is, I truly believe, and I believe all evidence tells us that with certainty, this is really a book written by Solomon. And as we get into the first chapter, we see evidences of that. Amazing thing about my title theme, a book without time or place, 10th century BC, written 3,000 years ago. But I challenge us all to see if there's anything that seems like it's dated. It's not dealing with things that are temporal, but things that are eternal. And so it is just as relevant for us today. And again, that difficult word to spell, the difficult word to pronounce even, Ecclesiastes, referring to the assembly. And though Solomon was a king, he calls himself the preacher, though he refers a lot to his life as king. But he's here to address the assembly. And that assembly includes us. And so we get to see ultimately the wisdom of God, who is the ultimate author, but also the wisdom that he sees through the lens of his experience and all that he had lived in the world. And of course, as we're seeing in this first chapter, it does have many deep thoughts of every aspect of life. And much of it's referring to that which is under the sun, which is used 30 times, including more than once in the first chapter. But it's so applicable to us today. So we see here in the very beginning, it is the words of the preacher gathered before the assembly to share, earnestly exhort, to explain, to share with us thoughts from God, but through the lens of his experience. And we see it was the son of David, king in Jerusalem, and we went last time and looked at his lineage, and we also see just how exceedingly great Scripture says that Solomon's wisdom was. So we should have attentive ears. Wisdom is a wonderful thing. It's worth more than any riches or wealth, and that's what Solomon sought. And so we started to dive in, seeing him as the author, seeing the wisdom that he had. And themes begin to emerge about the vanity of vanities and what does man gain by all the toil under the sun. Nature is described just as it was then, as it still is today, about the sun and the wind and the sea. And he said there's really nothing new under the sun. And so we have the emergence here as we review some of these deep thoughts. This theme of vanity, hebel, a vapor. It's something temporal. We're often consumed with the temporal. Our time, our effort, our toil, our anxiety are often things that do not matter. And he says, what does a man gain? Which is a question, a deep thought we ought to ask ourselves. What are we spending our time, effort, and toil on? What are we attempting to gain? So much of our world is focused on material wealth and these things that are so fleeting. And we think that things are different in our generation, and I saw even this week robots on TV, and we think of AI and everything, but the reminder of the natural world shows us there are common things in this world that do not go away. And so we're going to continue on from these themes today. And I want to say a little bit more here about the theme of the book before we continue, and this is our transition into part 2. Thinking about this further this week, I noticed something in terms of my theme, the book without time or place. Of course, Solomon was an Old Testament king, but very little in this book does he tie in to the Old Testament, or the history of Israel, or the Jewish people per se. It's a much more universal book. Things like, what does a man gain by toiling under the sun? These thoughts on nature, these are all universal aspects. And so very much of the book has this universal nature to it. And that's what I was getting at with the description of my theme today. And so it has no scope with regard to exact time. In fact, you would have a hard time pinpointing it. We have archaeological evidence and other things that take us there, but we wouldn't know that. Geography, individual people groups, nations. So it's really this deep philosophical book with ageless questions for all of us to consider. So let's continue our study. Going on, so we transition from verse 10 to 11, delving a little deeper. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be amongst those who come after. Verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under the heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of men to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. Let's pause there with a few thoughts. So really, this is the end of the first course of statements. And if you were looking at the book, maybe if you're reading along in your own Bible, you'll notice it's kind of indented there. It kind of goes back and forth. So he does this, and then he has a summative statement. He talks about this no remembrance of former things, and that's a statement you'd also find in places like in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and other places. And it's easy to not learn from the past because there's continuous cycles. There's the importance of history. It says those who forget the past are going to repeat it. And we know in our individual lives that one definition of insanity is repeating the same things over and over again. So we see here that there is a cycle. Previously, he talked about the cycle of nature itself and the earth. But there's also the cycle that we see in humanity of a pattern. And yes, while technology changes and names change, kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. People come to power and people fall from power. And these things continue to cycle over time. More on the author, too. We see here that he again is calling himself, and he's reflecting upon his time as the king of Israel, but he's also referring to himself as the preacher. So he does this multiple times. And that relates to the earlier discussion. But again, it doesn't seem to me as if most of the statements are focused on a time of Israel or the Old Testament law, but dealing more with these cycles like we were talking about here, the universal things. And I wanted to also say this. This is a challenging book, which I like challenges, but I can already tell this book's going to be a little bit of work for me, and maybe a little bit of work for you as well. We have to be careful with some of the interim conclusions that are drawn and put them in context. This is part of a larger book, and sometimes it may seem depressing with his thoughts. This is an unhappy business. This is sad. It's all vanity. If we're not careful and we just stop there without the whole discussion, we're going to get to the end of the book. It goes through a transition throughout it. So we have to make sure that when we see these interim conclusions and these statements being made, that we don't think that this is the author's final conclusions, that there's going to be more coming. Now, he also does a very bold thing here. When we go back here and it says, he sought to search out by wisdom all that is done. He called it an unhappy business. So he decided to catalog it, to search it. And he determined that everything was vanity. But he's wise, but there's only so much that he can do. And it made me think of another wise person who lived, and Benjamin Franklin, so important to the country of the United States. And at times in his life, we think of him as a statesman, a politician, an inventor, and a business person. He did all these things, but there was a time in his life, he said, in his wisdom, he was an incredibly intelligent person. He said, I've decided I'm going to catalog every sin, and I'm just going to purpose that I will never sin. I will never commit another sin again. But of course, he couldn't even make it a day. So even these wise men, whether we think about the time of Solomon, and he had his failures, or more recently Benjamin Franklin, they could be men of great wisdom, but they still were frail in their humanity as each and every one of us. He continues on. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Now, we can think of crooked in one sense. I think of, I'm not a crook. A crook is in a person committing crimes, and it certainly can mean that. But there is another application, that which is mysterious. It's difficult to comprehend. It can be lacking in an answer. He said there are things that are crooked. They're not so straight to the naked eye. They're not so easy to grasp. It can be difficult to count. It's challenging, and that creates humility. And there are things we know, and there's things we don't know. We talked about Solomon as a wise man. We talked about the example of Benjamin Franklin. We could even talk about Albert Einstein. Getting into even more modern times, an absolute genius, but he realized when it came to the knowledge of the world, he didn't even have really a thimble's worth of understanding. He couldn't even grasp the potential to know, in all of his wisdom, even 10% of the world's knowledge. It humbles us because we want to have answers. And actually, for somebody who's extremely wise, like a Albert Einstein, like a Benjamin Franklin, like a Solomon, it is very humbling because there are things that they just can't count. There are things that they just can't see straight. It is humbling. And so, that leads to the next point. He said, so I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. My heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and that is absolutely true. He lived it out. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. But I perceive that this also is but a striving after the wind. For much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. I talked about how difficult it is for those that are in wisdom. They kind of know what they don't know. And so they have a knowledge, and they also have the ability to understand what they don't even understand. And that can create vexation. That can create, again, this humility. And even with his experience and wisdom, and even when he applied his heart as hard as he could, there were deep thoughts that are difficult to comprehend. You ever heard the phrase, ignorance is bliss? It's sometimes better to not know things That actually is an idea. We're looking here 1,000 years before Christ in Ecclesiastes, but Sophocles and Erasmus, and there's a famous poem, Thomas Gray, where ignorance is blessed as folly to be wise. That might seem counterintuitive, but give it some thought. When you increase in wisdom and you increase in knowledge, then you know the truth, and that can be hard to be wise. And at first you think, no, I want to know everything. Well, I think one of the reasons we often want to amuse ourselves and be distracted, we are a culture that does that, but it's so have countless other cultures before us, is it keeps us from letting our minds spin and think about deep, deep thoughts. Remembering being a child and not yet aware of hard truths. If you start to think about even the cosmos themselves, things that can't be counted, how many stars are in the galaxy? What is the size and scope of the universe? Even in our natural world, as we think about every created thing and how there's a purpose, even for certain animals that seem so vicious or awful, but yet they have a purpose in the world. And everything has a place. And over time we get the layers pulled back and we become more and more and more aware of truth. And we gain knowledge, but the more we gain, the more we realize we don't understand. And so that can be vexing. That can be challenging. Think about the knowledge you've acquired in your lifetime. Think about all the things you know. Since you've been a child, think of what you've acquired, but then think about what you don't know. Well, I want to end today. I told you this is a book of deep thoughts. I'm giving you things here. I want you to think about it yourself. But one of the hardest issues that we can think about is coming to the knowledge of the truth of our own sins. What if we tried to catalog that, to come to a full knowledge of it? Often we're just ignorance. And maybe it would be nice in some ways, but it would not really be helpful to be in ignorance. There's a time we come to knowledge. For example, in Acts 9:18, there was a point where Paul was literally blind, and he was also spiritually blind. But the scales fell from his eyes, and he could physically see, and he could spiritually see, and he had a greater knowledge of the truth. Yet even as he gained that knowledge, he said, eye has not seen, and ear has not heard of all of the things of God. And one of the things that's wonderful about that's what he's prepared for us. He says that we're looking at a mirror darkly. We can only comprehend in part. And even the wisest man, such as Solomon, was in that same place. But when we come to that knowledge, I was also thinking of that beautiful hymn of Amazing Grace. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Do you remember the first time you came to the knowledge of the truth of your own sins? How humbling that was, how painful it was. Sometimes the knowledge of the truth is difficult, but it's through that we can see who we really are. And boy, trying to fathom the things of God, a lot of this reminds me of the book of Job as well. There's so much we know and there's so much we don't know. But that knowledge of the truth points us to our dependence upon God. Benjamin Franklin said he did not want to sin anymore, but he did. Solomon in his wisdom continued to sin, and so did each and every one of us. We need to be wise to the truth of that. We need to see ourselves as we really are. But in that moment, true wisdom, the beginning of wisdom, we are told in the Bible, is acknowledging God, and we need Him, and we are dependent upon Him. Solomon comes to that truth. We'll see it unfold itself in this book, but I want to share with you now. Be wise. It's hard, but understand this, that the truth is we have also, we're all lost, but we can be found. God wants to find us. He found us through His Son, Jesus Christ.